The chamber of the Galactic Council was vast enough to hold the navies of lesser worlds, yet it echoed with something more suffocating than size: certainty. Species that had ruled the stars for millennia leaned back in their carved thrones, eyes glittering with quiet amusement, as the subject of humanity arose once more. Earth's emissaries had spoken boldly of peace, of mutual security, of shared prosperity, and the Council, in its arrogance, mistook it for trembling. To them, the talk of treaties and restraint was not strategy, but submission. They saw in humanity's careful diplomacy the shadow of fear, and nothing stirred their disdain more than weakness. For ages these elder races had crafted empires without ever truly enduring conflict beyond the scale of border raids. Most had been guided into interstellar unity by necessity, folding rivals into consensus before war could truly take root. Entire civilizations had never known the concept of annihilation. They understood force, but not slaughter. They could speak of campaigns, but not genocide. In their memory, war was a thing managed, clean, and ultimately forgettable. When they looked upon the human record of diplomacy, they filtered it through their own experience. Creatures who spoke endlessly of peace must be desperate to avoid war. The conclusion was too easy, and so they never questioned it. A handful of voices objected. A Saurian delegate, scales darkened with age, warned that humanity's history was more complex. He spoke of records recovered from Earth's transmissions, wars that spanned continents, wars that consumed millions in months, wars where cities were erased in a single stroke. He told of nations clawing themselves from the ashes, of alliances forged not from kinship but from necessity, of weapons built with the promise to end civilizations overnight. Yet his words found little purchase. The Council, steeped in their own certainty, laughed quietly at his warnings. They saw only scattered savagery from a primitive past, not a reflection of present character. Surely, they reasoned, a people who spoke now of coexistence must have left that barbarism behind out of weakness, not choice. When disputes on the galactic frontier began to stir, the Council saw opportunity. Human colonies brushed against territories claimed by another young species, and tensions sharpened. To the Council this was nothing more than a test, a stage upon which humanity would reveal itself. Would Earth bend the knee? Would its emissaries arrive with trembling voices, eager to buy peace at any price? They expected pleas, compromises, perhaps even submission. The arrogance with which they awaited this display was not born of malice, but of conviction. They believed they understood humanity because they had already judged the pattern. Within their hall, laughter rippled as reports arrived of the brewing confrontation. They imagined humans as children stepping into a predator's den, unaware of the danger surrounding them. Delegates compared them to small herbivores, thrashing at the first hint of conflict. Some wondered aloud whether this would end humanity's brief climb into the Council's notice altogether, a mere footnote in the archives of failed civilizations. Predictions of collapse circulated freely, and wagers were placed on how quickly Earth would send envoys begging for mediation. Yet there lingered an unease beneath the mockery, a faint tremor in the room that none wished to admit. The few who studied human history too deeply did not join the laughter. They remembered accounts of soldiers fighting in wastelands rendered uninhabitable, of fleets scuttled not to deny resources but to deny hope. They saw something the others ignored, the pattern of a species that had survived the worst its own kind could inflict. But those who voiced such concerns were met with scorn. Humanity, the Council declared, was a race that feared war, and in fear they would remain obedient. What they did not realize, what they had no framework to even imagine, was that humans had lived with war as long as they had lived with fire. To the Council, fear of war meant weakness. To humanity, fear of war meant knowledge. Yet in the chamber, under the cold light of ancient stars, that truth lay invisible. All that the Council believed in that moment was the illusion they had woven for themselves, that Earth was a child among giants, ready to crumble at the first true test. The Council adjourned that day confident in their judgment. Their records noted humanity as cautious, fragile, desperate to avoid conflict. No resolution was passed to prepare for resistance. No fleets were ordered to stand watch. Why would they be? In their view, humans were already contained, already defeated, already understood. What remained was to wait, to watch, and to learn how quickly fear would drive Earth to its knees. They thought they knew the answer. They thought history would repeat in the way it always had for weaker civilizations. But as events began to unfold, as the spark of confrontation was struck, the Council would soon discover how little they truly understood. The first envoys humanity sent into the void carried themselves with restraint. Their speeches before the Council were careful, composed, deliberate. They spoke of treaties, of shared scientific pursuits, of the dangers of unnecessary conflict. To outsiders, this seemed nothing more than timidity wrapped in diplomacy. The aliens who listened only heard hesitation, a reluctance to step fully into the harsh theater of galactic politics. What they failed to grasp was that those words did not come from fear. They came from experience. For humanity, peace was never a birthright. It was earned, clawed from centuries of conflict that scarred every generation. When human ambassadors offered compromise, it was not because they lacked the will to fight but because they knew better than most what fighting truly cost. To the Council, the careful tone of humans sounded like the voice of a prey species seeking protection. To humans, it was discipline, the restraint of a predator who understood exactly what it was capable of. Few in that chamber had ever studied human history deeply enough to understand. They did not know of the centuries when wars were constant, when borders shifted in blood every decade, when entire peoples were erased from memory. They had not seen the records of cities burning under the skies of their own world, of families scattered into ash, of nations rebuilt from rubble only to collapse again. Where most advanced species grew into unity without great internal conflict, humanity had survived wave after wave of self-destruction. It was not ignorance of war that shaped human diplomacy, but the memory of how easily it could consume everything. The Council had no frame of reference for this. Their worlds rarely saw the extremes humanity endured. Their conflicts ended quickly, settled before desperation carved itself into the bones of their people. For them, restraint was born of weakness. For humanity, restraint was born of memory, an understanding that war was always close, always waiting, and always ready to devour everything if allowed to run free. Human leaders who stood before the Council did not wear their scars openly, but they carried the weight of them nonetheless. They remembered histories where alliances collapsed under pride, where arrogance cost millions of lives, where the desire for conquest left only ashes. These memories were not distant mythology, they were lessons etched into cultural identity. Humanity had learned, generation after generation, that victory in war did not mean survival, and that survival itself was sometimes indistinguishable from loss. Yet this truth was invisible to those who judged them. Aliens heard words of peace and mistook them for confessions of fragility. They saw humanity's willingness to sign accords as desperation, when it was in fact caution sharpened to an edge. Peace was not chosen because humans were weak. It was chosen because they knew too well what the alternative looked like. The Council could not imagine how deeply the memory of struggle ran in the human psyche. They did not understand that every city skyline was built atop ruins of older wars. They did not know that every triumph in science, art, and philosophy was shadowed by the knowledge of how close humanity had come to extinguishing itself. They thought peace was humanity's natural state, but it was not. It was a deliberate act, maintained only by constant vigilance against old instincts and older mistakes. Humanity's restraint was mistaken for timidity because the Council lacked context. When they saw silence, they thought of weakness. When they saw compromise, they thought of surrender. But behind every diplomatic phrase lay a truth no alien understood: war was not some distant nightmare for humans. It was a companion that had walked beside them since their earliest days, when they had only barely managed to keep leashed. The mistake was inevitable. The Council's arrogance blinded them to the difference between fear and discipline. They assumed humans sought peace to escape war, when in truth humans sought peace because they knew exactly what war would bring. That difference, subtle and invisible to outsiders, was the line between prey and predator. And when the time came, when the mask of diplomacy was finally set aside, the Council would learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. The first strike came suddenly. A human colony on the edge of Council-monitored space went dark after an assault by a younger, aggressive species eager to test its strength. To the Council, this was the moment they had been waiting for. They leaned back in satisfaction, convinced the humans would fold, that panic would dictate their every step. They expected frantic messages pleading for mediation, desperate attempts to barter safety in exchange for compliance. None arrived. Instead, the response was silence, cold, deliberate silence. The Council misread it as shock, but among humans it was calculation. Within hours, fleets were mobilized, logistics chains awakened, and veterans recalled. Colonies rallied not with despair but with determination. From shipyards orbiting Earth to outposts on distant moons, preparation unfolded with a precision that unsettled even those watching from afar. When the first human warships entered contested space, they did not come with fanfare or threat. They came with methodical coordination, their actions as efficient as breathing. There was no hesitation, no bluster, no sign of the fear the Council had imagined. Where the aggressors had expected disarray, they instead met formations that adapted instantly to their movements, strategies shifting mid-battle as if the humans had anticipated every possible maneuver. Reports filtered back to the Council chamber, and the smug certainty began to fracture. These were not the panicked thrashings of prey. This was something else entirely, something honed by long familiarity. Alien observers remarked with unease that humans fought as though war was not new to them, but an old language they were simply speaking again after years of restraint. Every action carried the weight of memory, as if generations of conflict had been rehearsing them for this very moment. The more the enemy pressed, the sharper humanity became. When fleets were outnumbered, they split and struck with precision at supply lines, forcing their foes into starvation. When ground was lost, human forces shifted to guerrilla tactics, striking from shadows, disrupting infrastructure, making every inch of advance a bleeding wound. No victory for the enemy came without cost, and those costs mounted with terrifying speed. The Council had seen wars before, but never one where the weaker side fought with such efficiency, turning desperation into a weapon. What unnerved alien strategists most was the demeanor of human soldiers and commanders. There was no frenzy, no blind rage. They did not revel in conflict, nor did they shrink from it. They met battle with the cold calm of people who had walked this road too many times before. To them, war was not an anomaly. It was a reality they had been shaped by since their earliest history, and their familiarity gave them a resilience the Council had not prepared for. Whispers spread quickly through the Council's halls. Delegates who had once mocked Earth now spoke in hushed tones of what they were seeing. Humanity was not collapsing under pressure, it was thriving within it. Even defeats became lessons, turned into new strategies overnight. The adaptability was relentless, a mirror of centuries when survival had depended on learning faster than rivals, or perishing. Every assumption the Council had made was unraveling. The war escalated, but the balance of power shifted in unexpected ways. The enemy who had struck first began to falter, unable to match the pace of a species that had endured cycles of destruction and recovery on its own world. The Council realized, with growing dread, that humanity did not fear war at all. They respected it, understood it, and wielded it with a precision that turned arrogance into regret. What had begun as a test became a revelation. The Council, watching from their great chamber, were forced to confront the truth that unsettled them most. They had mistaken humanity's silence for fear, when it had always been calculation. The humans did not beg for peace because they lacked the will to fight. They pursued peace because they knew war too well. And when war found them, they did not stumble. They stood with the calm certainty of a people who had survived it before and would survive it again. The reports piled higher with each passing day, and with them came an uneasy silence that crept through the Council chamber. What had begun as amusement, then shifted to confusion, had now hardened into something far more dangerous: recognition. Humanity was not fighting like the desperate prey they had expected. They were fighting with the weary precision of those who had been here before. Every maneuver, every sacrifice, every act of endurance revealed a truth that the Council had been unwilling to see. Humans did not fear war. They feared what it turned them into. Generations of internal conflict had forged that understanding. Their own history was scarred with wars so vast and so merciless that other species could not comprehend them. They had seen their skies filled with fire, their oceans poisoned, their cities turned to dust. They knew that war stripped away illusions, reducing noble ideals to ash and leaving only survival. This memory lived within their culture, not as distant myth, but as an ever-present shadow. To the council races, war was a disruption, an unfortunate accident to be ended quickly. To humanity, war was a predator they had faced countless times. They did not glamorize it, did not seek it, but they understood it intimately. That familiarity gave them an advantage none of the elder races possessed. The humans fought not with joy, but with grim acceptance. They knew the cost before the first shots were fired, and still they chose to endure it when survival demanded it. Council analysts began to piece together fragments of Earth's history they had once dismissed. They studied records of soldiers who endured winters without food, of fleets that fought until nothing remained, of civilians who rebuilt from ruins again and again. They read of conflicts where peace was declared not because one side triumphed, but because both were exhausted beyond endurance. From these lessons, humanity had drawn a conclusion none of the council had considered: peace was not the absence of strength, but the restraint of it. In this light, the mask of diplomacy that once looked like weakness took on a different meaning. Humans were not timid when they sought treaties. They were disciplined. They bargained not because they could not fight, but because they knew better than most what fighting would bring. Peace was not an instinct, it was a choice, forced upon them by the memory of the abyss. And when that choice was denied, when others mistook it for cowardice, they revealed the truth the council feared to admit. Alien civilizations had survived by avoiding total destruction. Humanity had survived by enduring it. This distinction became clearer with each battle. Where other species might break under sustained losses, humans adapted, their resolve hardening. Where others might fracture into dissent, humans unified under pressure, rallying around the very adversity meant to crush them. It was not glory that drove them, but survival ingrained into every fiber of their being. This realization unsettled the council more than human weapons or tactics. Weapons could be countered. Strategies could be studied. But the mindset that carried humanity through endless cycles of conflict could not be replicated or undone. It was the product of scars that stretched back thousands of years, scars so deep they shaped identity itself. One delegate captured the truth in a whisper not meant for record: humanity did not treat war as a stranger. They treated it as an old companion, one they despised yet could never forget. They did not fear battlefields. They feared what would happen if they embraced them too readily. Their caution was born of wisdom, their diplomacy of restraint, and their ferocity of survival. The council now understood that their error was not simply underestimating human strength, but misunderstanding the foundation of their character. Humanity's greatest weapon was not their fleets, nor their armies, but their capacity to endure horror and rise from it stronger. Against such a people, intimidation was meaningless, and threats only hastened the outcome they most wished to avoid. The truth had become undeniable. Humanity did not shun war because they were afraid of it. They shunned war because they knew it too well. And that knowledge, that hard-earned familiarity, was precisely what made them the most dangerous species the Council had ever encountered. The conflict ended not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The aggressors who had first struck at human colonies found themselves bled dry, their fleets shattered, their resolve broken. Humanity did not press the advantage to seize their worlds or expand empires. When the enemy's capacity to threaten survival was ended, humanity stopped. They withdrew from occupied systems, rebuilt their colonies, and returned to the table of diplomacy with the same calm voices that had once been mistaken for weakness. To the Council, this restraint was almost as terrifying as the war itself. For them, it was natural to expect vengeance, domination, or at the very least expansion. That was the pattern of power they understood. Yet humanity did none of these things. They fought to survive, and having secured survival, they set aside the sword. The same species that had fought with merciless efficiency was now offering reconciliation, trade, and dialogue. To races that had never endured total war, this seemed contradictory, even irrational. But to humans, it was the only logical path. Peace was always preferable, and war was always the last resort, but when war became inevitable, it was pursued until safety was restored, and not a step further. The council, shaken by what they had witnessed, began to alter their view. No longer were humans catalogued as a fragile, timid newcomer. They were reclassified as a power to be respected, perhaps even feared. Whispered debates filled the chambers about how such a species should be treated. Some argued they should be courted as allies, a stabilizing force in uncertain times. Others feared they were a threat greater than any seen before, a danger that would one day turn upon the council itself. What none could deny was that humanity had shattered every assumption upon which their judgments had rested. Within human circles, there was no triumphalism. Victory was not celebrated with grandeur, but with relief. Cities rebuilt, families mourned, and fleets returned not to parades but to silence. Humanity understood what had been lost, and what had been narrowly preserved. They carried themselves not as conquerors but as survivors, aware that each conflict left scars deeper than the stars could measure. Their strength lay not only in their ability to fight, but in their refusal to let war consume their identity. When the council finally convened to address humanity directly, the tone had shifted entirely. Gone was the mockery and patronizing amusement. Delegates spoke with measured caution, acknowledging contributions, offering respect. For the first time in memory, the chamber's arrogance gave way to something else: humility. Humanity had not demanded submission to earn it. They had simply shown the truth of what they were. The message was simple, but it resonated across the galaxy. Humanity did not fight because they loved war. They fought because they had learned, again and again, that survival sometimes demanded it. Their power did not come from seeking conflict, but from enduring it without losing themselves completely. In this, they stood apart from every other species that looked upon them with disbelief. The council now understood the lesson they had overlooked. When humans spoke of peace, it was not out of fear. It was out of memory of a companion they could never forget, a shadow that walked beside them through history. War was not foreign to them, nor was it a tool of pride. It was a curse they had lived with, a burden they carried, and a danger they had mastered without ever taming. The galaxy would remember that revelation. Where once humanity was dismissed, they now stood as a reminder of endurance itself. Their restraint was no longer mistaken for weakness, and their voice in council chambers carried a new weight. They had proven that the truest strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the discipline to know when not to. And those who had once laughed at Earth now understood: it was not humanity who feared war. It was the rest of the galaxy who feared what humanity became when war was forced upon them.